Let us now talk about testing. Right? Testing is probably the most complex component of the Office 365 DSC because we do a lot of tests to make sure that the quality of what we release is there, and also to make sure that what we deploy to Office 365 tenants doesn't break anything. So we do several types of testing. Let me start off by just bringing up the actual Office 365 DSC workspace. So again, github.com/Microsoft/Office 365 DSC for desired state configuration. If you go in the pull request, what I want to show you is just let's take a look at a pull request that was recently merged into the main code base. So this one here, and let's take a look at the details. So every time we go and we create a new pull request. So a pull request is basically, all right, so you've done some work. Let's say you created a new resource using the previous example, the Teams channel policy. You created that resource and you're ready to commit it back so that it becomes part of the official code base. So you submit something we call a PR, so pull request, and automatically that triggers several tests. The first one we see listed here is something called the full circle test. So for full circle test is this idea of, since we have reverse DSC baked in Office 365 DSC, that allows you to extract a full fidelity representation of what the current configuration of your Office 365 environment is. So full circle test start by extracting all configuration settings of your environment, right? So we have an integration environment right now. So it's extracting from that integration environment. And then once it has that, it tries to make sure that it can compile the extracted configuration. So compilation of a DSC file is another step of validation. So if it doesn't compile, that means that your extracted component or your extracted configuration had issues, meaning that the code you committed doesn't properly let you extract configuration. So if it compiles, then what it's going to try to do is going to take that compiled version and do an assessment of that extracted configuration against what the current environment is, right? So it's this idea of, all right, tell me how you're currently configured. So you get the configuration and you go and you ask the question, are you really sure that this is how you're configured, right? So that's what full circle test is about. So that one has to pass, right? So this one really focuses on the extract target resource and on the reverse DSC scenario. The second one is the integration test. So if you take a look inside of your project and you find the test folder at the root, you're going to see integration and there is a master test. So that master test here is a file that lists all of the various components that we have, and we're asking everybody that submits a new resource to put in at least one instance of their resource. So if we go back to our previous example, let me just go back to my DSC folder. Right? If we remember correctly, in episode 10, we extracted a configuration. So we extracted this here. I'm going to go in and copy this, and I'm just going to go and put it inside of my integration test. So it doesn't matter what it is, really. All that this is going to do is it's going to go in and try to create a new Teams channel policy. So let's do integration channel policy. Right, so we're just going to leave this as it, and then okay. So that's really all you need to do for the integration. We're just asking you to put in one instance of the new resource you created, and then when you go and execute that test, this is going to go and deploy that configuration. So integration test does really two things. So it's going to go and deploy that main file. So it's going to go and deploy everything that's there against an integration tenant, and then once the integration deployment is done, it's going to go and call a function we call test DSC configuration that is going to go and validate that the environment is in the desired state or is in a state that matches this script here. Right? So again, another validation. The unit test is something we'll get back to. This one here is by far the most tricky. We're using something called Pester to be able to go and write our unit test. The unit tests are being run in two locations right now. They are being run in Azure DevOps, right? So the unit test one here, do you see that's Azure DevOps? It's running as a separate job. And then we also have AppVeyor. AppVeyor runs the exact same unit test, but on top of it, it also does resource syntax analysis, and it generates our wiki pages. Okay, so this is really important. Unit test is kind of a subset. It runs the same test. The AppVeyor one is more complex, or more complete, sorry. And the reason why we're doing this in the two location is at one point we're trying to move out of AppVeyor and move everything into unit or Azure DevOps for our automated unit test. The PowerShell team right now is not done converting all the tests over to Azure DevOps. Once this is done, you can foresee that this one here is actually going to disappear and we're only going to be left with unit test. All right, that said, the last thing we do is there's two more things we do. We do a code review, right? So every time the tests all are successful, somebody from the core team is going to go in and review your code. We're not picky. Really, what we're trying to do is ensure consistency across resources and also make sure that the logic makes sense from an error handling perspective. For reviewable, for code review, we actually use reviewable. So if we take a look at this here, reviewable, and there will list all of the various files that have been modified, and then we will provide comments on the various lines that we feel like you should review or change. That's it for the code review. The last one is code coverage. So code coverage is done automatically when you go and submit your changes. Let me just find that here. Actually, code coverage here is done automatically when you try to go and merge it. Right now, we're aiming for 90% code coverage. And we can clearly see here that both the dev and branch or master branches are below that threshold. So that means we're going to have to go and improve some of the test coverage. That is on us to do, but basically your code should always make sure that the unit tests cover at least 90% of all the code that you have. And we are using Codecove for that. So if you do drill into Codecove, you can see where some of the resources, for example, the ones that are in red are the ones with the lowest coverage percentage. So if I go take a look at this one here, I can drill down and it is going to tell me exactly. Sorry about this. I'm just trying to remember how this thing works. All right, there we go. So let's say this one here, there's definitely something wrong with that one. If we take a look at it, so this one here seems like it's missing unit test entirely. Right, so this is something we fixed before we published the gallery, no worries there. But everything that's in red are lines that have not been automatically tested by unit tests. So we need to go and write tests that will make sure they cover all of the highlighted lines there, or at least 90% of them. We understand that it's almost impossible in all cases to do 100% code coverage, though this is what we should be aiming for sure. All right, so this concludes the actual code coverage. The next thing I wanted to show you is I mentioned several times that we do automate the generation of our wiki pages. So AppVeyor right now, if you go back, this is the last successful PR. I'm going to go back to view details. If I take a look at AppVeyor, so you can see the entire job execution from here, but also there's a section called artifacts, and in there you're going to have a wiki content.zip, and this zip file will contain all the markdown files for all the automatically generated wiki pages for all of the resources. Right, so we don't have somebody manually creating those pages, don't worry. We put our time to better use, so this is done automatically. So it's this concept of automatically documenting your resources. As long as your README files, your examples, and your schema files are good, the wiki page is gonna contain everything that's required by the users. Now, let's go back to unit tests. So I'm gonna go in my Office 365 DSC fork, and in there is a test folder. Under tests, there's unit test, and there's two main folders. There is the stub folders, and there is the Office 365 DSC folder. Under Office 365 DSC, you're going to see a test file or PS1 file for every resource that the module supports. what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go and again take the calling policy, copy that one, paste it back, and I am going to rename it to channels policy, because remember, I am lazy. All right, so teams channel policies. Perfect. So my file is created. Now, if I go back to my Visual Studio Code environment, I should see my new folder created, or my new file. Perfect. Now, to be quite honest, this video is not about explaining you all of the logic that's going on under the cover with our test. What I want you to get out of this video is really how to easily and quickly get started with writing your own unit test. What I'm going to do here is basically the first thing you need to do is update the actual resource you're going to be testing. So channels is the one I want to test. And now let's think about the various scenarios that we have, right? So we have a scenario where we want to test when people are doing a reverse DSC extraction, for example. So we need to have a test for that. We need to have a test when people are trying to update a resource that already exists that is not in the desired state. So one of its settings, for example, has a configuration drift. We need to test a scenario where we're creating a brand new policy. We need to test a scenario where we're trying to update a property, or we're actually trying to update a channel policy that is already in the desired state. That is one scenario we need to support as well. And the last one is when we have an existing channel policy that should not exist, we need to go and remove it. So in this case here, what we're going to be doing is I'm going to go in, and this here is the first scenario. Well, let me backtrack a bit. Pester test or unit test is all about mocking methods, right? Mocking a method means faking the result of a certain method. The idea is that we don't want our unit test to make real calls back to the Office 365 environment. Right? Instead, we're going to be mocking them, so creating a clone of those methods and returning manual results, if you want. So in this case here, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be mocking the new CS Teams channels policy. Right, so this method here, whenever in my actual file, so let me go back to find my resource. So if I go in and open Teams channel policy, in there, whenever I call new Teams channel, instead of calling the real commandlet that's part of the Skype for Business module, it's going to call into my mock, and it's just going to return nothing. Right? Because the new function is really just a void method. Set is the exact same thing. You don't return anything when you call into set. The remove function, again, same thing. So that's going to be an empty result. Perfect. Okay. So now my three main methods have been mocked. There's one method left, and that is the get CS Teams channel policy. These methods here, if you take a look at it, they're, the mocks are defined outside of the context, right? Contexts are really the unique test that you want to have. So every test that you do is its own context. By defining those outside of the context block, that means they are global. So every test is going to have access to that mock here. Because my get function is going to be unique to each test, I want to have the mock inside the actual context. Right? So the first one is when a channel policy doesn't exist, but it should. Okay? So let me just cheat again. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to go back to my text file. I'm going to be bringing this here. And then, all right, so this here, test params is the fake parameters I'm going to be pretending to call my resource with. So this is going to be a test channels policy. I am just going to go and put this here. Again, remember, trying to keep things as clean as possible, aligning everything. There's one property that's missing. This one here actually doesn't belong there, and it's description. All right, thanks for bearing with me. So off we go. So this is how I'm going to be calling the resource. Now the get CS Teams calling policy in this scenario where the channel policy doesn't already exist should return null. So this is the idea. Whenever I go and call this, on identity. So I'm trying to get a channel policy named test channels policy. It needs to return null because it doesn't exist, right? Now, with pester is you actually need to go and assert what you want to see happen. Okay. So the first one is from the get target resource, I want to make sure that the ensure property is set to absent, meaning that the get target resource will not find an existing instance of this here. Right? So that's the first one. So that one is good. I can leave it as is. The second one is the test, right? So when the test method is going to go and basically assert is that resource existing, it's going to come back as false. So that's good again. The third one here is the set, right? So basically the set in this case is going to go and try to create the new policy because it doesn't exist. So what I want to do is I'm going to call into the set target resource. It's going to go and do its code execution. And then at the end of it, I want to make sure that I have called the new CS Teams channel policy exactly one time. Let me show you what this means. I'm going to go inside the set function. So the set is right here. I'm coming in, I'm getting the current target value, which is null, right? So it's going to be returning this here, ensure equals absent. And I'm going to be doing a compare. So I'm getting in, I'm going, all right, so it should be present. The current values are set to absent. So this is our scenario right now. Therefore, call the new CS Teams channel policy. And you're done your execution. So my test validates that this function has been called exactly once. So we're good. Let's move on to the next one. The next one is, and I'm just going to be copying this over because I'm going to be using it quite often. So the next one is when the policy exists, but it's not in the desired state. So we need to update it. So let me paste this in. Now what I'm going to be doing this time around, the get CS Teams calling policy mock is not going to return empty. It's actually going to return something, but it's going to return something that has different values than what I would expect. So I'm going to go in here, paste this in, just align everything. Right. So what it's going to do is, let's say it's going to return false for the allow org-wide team creation. Right. So the idea is, this is what my desired state should be. Everything should be set to true. But the reality is that for this policy, this setting, is set to false. So there is a configuration drift. When we have a configuration drift, we get into that second case here where we basically say, all right, both are present. It is present and it should be present. So there's a configuration drift. Call the set method to update it, or the set CS Teams calling policy. I know I've probably lost you all, guys, by now, okay? It takes some practice. After doing a couple of those, you're going to understand that it's almost always the same patterns that come back, and you're going to get more familiar with the pester syntax, right? So do not worry. Really, the idea is start with an existing one, copy it over, and make the changes like I'm doing right now, okay? So let's do this scenario here. So I have a configuration drift. So the get target resource will return present because this policy, when I call the get Teams calling policy, is gonna return something, a policy with this name. So it exists, right? So it's present. The test target resource, however, is gonna return false because there is a configuration drift. This property here doesn't match. That's the current value and that's the desired value. They're not the same. So this is gonna return false. And then the third one is, all right, so since we have a configuration drift, inside of the set target resource, we should call the set CS Teams calling policy exactly once. Right? Going back here, this method here, it needs to be called once. Right? One thing you could do as well is you could go in and do, all right, so you know what? Yes, it should be called once, but on top of that, the new CS Teams calling policy should be called exactly 0 times, so it should never be called. Right? You can do that if you want to, right? That's just extra validation, and it's probably good practice to do it. Right now, I'm just trying to validate the positive scenarios. Okay? So that's good. So now we have 2 tests down. The third one is the policy exists, and it is already in the desired state. Right? So again, I think I copied something else. I'm just going to have to bring this back. I'm going to go here. I'm going to go paste this. So this is my my test parameters, and then this get target resource will return the exact same thing, right? So the difference here is that here's how I want my environment to be configured, or my policy, and here's how it currently is. They both match, right? So I didn't go and change the value of this one to false. They're both set to true, so there's no configuration drift. So in this case here, I'm just gonna go and the get method will return present, the test method will work, and you know what? The set target resource, as we explained in the previous video, this scenario will never happen. So you only ever call into the set target resource when you have a configuration drift. So, I mean, we could do something like, we could go in and do this if we wanted to. And again, probably is best practice, but I'm only validating the positive scenarios. So I can do something like should not do anything from the set method, and then this one here has to be called 0 times. We won't create a new teams, and the remove one is also going to be called 0 times. And that's really another way of validating it. Now the last one is the policy exists but it should not, right? So in this case here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this guy here to absent, meaning that the desired state is that there should never be a policy called test channels policy in my environment. Then this one here is going to go and return 1. So we have a situation where we should not have any policy existing by the name of teams channel policy, and we actually do have one, because when we call the get CS teams calling policy, or channel policy, actually I forgot to change that in a couple of places, it should always return this instance here, but it should never be there. Sorry. All right, let me just go and quickly update those. I am going to go and pause it. All right, then we're back. Sorry about that. So throughout the recording, there's a couple of places where I left calling policy instead of channels policy. This is the risk of copying over from an existing resource. However, the test would have failed, so I'm good on that front. So I renamed everything in there, so we're now good to go. So the idea is this test channel policy already exists, but it should not. So in this case, when you go and call the get target resource, get target is about the current state. So it will return present, meaning yes, there is one that exists. Test will assess the current environment against what the desired value should be. So there is one, but there should not be one, so therefore this will return false. And then the set target resource should remove the policy, right? So it should go in and it will detect that there's one and it should be there, so it's going to go and call the remove CS teams channel policy. So we're good on that front as well. Now the very last one is the reverse DSC. That one is going to go and test the export target resource feature. So again, the only test parameters that you need to bring in are the global admin account, because that's the only parameter that this function should ever accept. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and copy this here. And then I'm going to say that, all right, so we do have one, so we want to extract the configuration out of this existing policy. There we go. And then my test is going to be, it should reverse engineer resources from the export method, and I'm just going to be calling into the export target resource. That's it. Now my test is complete. One thing I'm going to do is just make sure that I don't have calling anywhere. All right, so I replaced all the callings by channels, so I'm good to go. Now what we're going to be doing is, as part of the actual project, let me just go back to my Windows Explorer project. In the test folder directly, there is this resource here, this module called test harness. That's the one that is going to go and run all your pester tests. So before you submit your PR, okay, before you try to submit anything, what you want to do is you want to test your unit test locally. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to go in and I'm going to go and import module C GitHub O365 test and then test harness. So that's the module I was just showing you. So I'm just going to go and import that module, and that gives me access to a new commandlet called invoke test harness. Now if you just run this, you may be you might end up waiting for like 10 minutes before the tests actually run, because it's going to go and try to calculate the code coverage. In this case here, we don't really care because code coverage is going to be done on GitHub anyway. What I want to do is I just want to use the ignore code coverage. So by putting that switch on, it's automatically going to kick off my test. So it's going to go in and you're going to see all the tests being executed right now. So it's going and it's describing all of the resources that we have. So let me just pause here for a sec. What I want to show you is this guy here. Yes, okay, great for pausing. But basically what we see is all those contexts as the purple lines, and all of the the actual assessments in green. So green is good, red is bad. We're gonna let this run. Right now, I think we're up to close to 700 different unit tests. So it's gonna take about 10 minutes to complete. I'm just gonna go and let this run, and we'll come back once all the tests have finished. And we're back again. And this time you can see that I actually have an error in one of my tests. So what it's doing, it's actually complaining about the fact that it can't find the new CS Teams channel policy. That was to be expected. Reason for this is, yeah, okay, we defined the mocks, but when you're doing unit tests, mocks are an implementation of something we called stubs, right? And stubs really are just the definition of your function, what parameters they take in, and what the name of the actual functions are. So if you take a look at under the test folder, there is another subfolder called stubs. And in there, what we have is all the various functions across all the various workloads with the method signature, but an empty method body. Let me give you a concrete example. So for example, if we take a look at, there should be a couple of simple ones here. This one, for example, right? The get Teams messaging policy. The messaging policy, the get function, takes in an optional parameter called identity. Right? That's all it does. So it's defining the signature of your function if you want. Okay. So what we're going to be doing is I'm going to go in and I'm going to be creating a stub for each one of the 4 functions that we are using inside of our test. The first one was the get Teams channels policy, and that one, just like the previous one, can take just an optional identity parameter. The other one is the remove CS Teams channels policy, identity. Third one was the new, and the new one takes on all the parameters that are actually defined at our resource level. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and find our Teams channel policy. I'm going to go in and I'm just going to copy the parameters from the signature, leaving ensure and global admin account out of there because those are specific to Office 365 DSC and not related to the actual CS Teams commandlet. So in there, I'm just going to go back to my stub. This is the signature of my params block. The third one is going to be the fourth one, sorry, is going to be the set Teams, and then this one here is channels policy. Perfect. Now the signature is going to be exactly the same, and this time around when I run my test, it's going to be able to find the stub, implement the mock, and then my test will run. Okay. At one point, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating an automated script that will go and scan all the various workloads, figure out what all of the commandlets are, and automatically generate the stubs. This is how we're doing it right now for SharePoint DSC, so the on-premises version. So we're doing it dynamically. The challenge with Office 365 DSC is that there are so many different dependencies that creating that was kind of a nightmare to begin with, but it's becoming, I think we've reached a point where we're almost going to be at 15,000 lines of stubs that we need to automate that for sure, right? So right now the process is do it manually. It takes about 2 minutes to do, but at one point we're going to be automating that. Now that our tests are saved, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and launch yet again a new console just to make sure that the latest version of my module is loaded. I'm going to re-import my test harness and I'm going to run it again. So we'll be back in about 10 minutes when the tests are done executing. All right, so now all the tests have come back and they were all successful. Right, I said we had about 700 tests. Oh, I lied. So the exact number is 649, and all of them actually passed. Now, if we want to scroll up a bit and find our team's channel policy, we can see that all our tests successfully executed. The one thing you need to do before submitting your PR is update the changelog. Changelog is where we keep track of all changes that have not been released. At the top there's an unreleased section. We also keep track of what was released in all the official versions on the gallery. So in my case here, I'm just going to go in and add a new entry for teams channels policy, and then I'm simply going to state that this is the initial release of that resource. Good, so now we are ready to go and create our pull request. So if I go back to my GitHub client, and again, this is just the way I'm doing it. I'm more of a visual guy. You can do it using the Git command line if you want to. I just prefer to use the GitHub client for Windows. So I can see all the changes I've made. I'm just gonna go in and do initial release for my branch teams channel policy. I commit that. I'm gonna go and push the changes up to GitHub. And now that this is done, I can go in and from the branch menu, create a pull request, or simply click on create pull request. That will launch the GitHub repository. I will say new resource teams channels policy. Now in here, basically what you can do is just provide a quick description. So initial release of new resource. Currently, this is not a bug fix, so it doesn't fix anything, so I'm just going to go with NA. Then I'm going to click on Create Pull Request, and that will initiate all the tests that I showed you previously. Now, as far as reviewers, by default, it will go and analyze that some of the files are modified, like changelog and others had Yorick as well, modifying them. So it's going to suggest that I ask Yorick for a review. You don't need to worry about that. Just don't assign anybody. You can put a label beside your actual PR. In this case here, I'm doing an enhancement. It's a new feature, so it's a new resource. So I'm just going to mark it as enhancement. And then what you can see is that the three tests, so the full circle, integration, and unit test, are now pending. So they are running along with the AppVeyor one. So this here can take up to an hour. I'm not going to lie. Some of them are actually fairly big tests, like the one from AppVeyor, where we analyze all the syntax, generate the wiki pages, and run the unit test. Full circle is also another one that can take a very long time. So we're just going to let this run again, and we're going to come back once the 4 tests have been successful. And we're back, so we can see that all the tests have successfully passed. Right, so everything's green. Now, the last thing really is, as a contributor, you're not going to see the option to go and merge a pull request. So at this stage, your PR is going to be sitting in the queue. Somebody from the core team is going to go and review it within 24 hours. Is going to assign the pull request to themselves for code review, and we're going to be using reviewable to do so. So we're going to be providing code review. Now let's say, for example, there's a couple of things you need to fix. You're going to get notified from reviewable and with the comments from the reviewer saying at line, let's say 1, 2, 3, you have a typo, please correct that. You go in, and then comes the back and forth between the code reviewer process and the actual changes. Once everything is ready to go, somebody from the core team will go and merge this pull request. Now, internally right now, the rule we have is that nobody goes and reviews their own PR, which kind of makes sense, right? So in my case here, I'm not allowed, even though I am technically allowed to click this button, but I shouldn't go and approve my own PR. Therefore, I'm just going to go and ask Yorick to go in and review that pull request. And within a few hours, Yorick's going to go provide his code review. If everything's good to go, He's gonna approve the pull request, and then I'm gonna be merging it back to the main code base. So hopefully this gives you a better overview of how things work. Internally as well, what I'm gonna do is every time a pull request passes, I go in from app there, I go and grab the latest version of the wiki page as I showed previously. So in this case here, I should have my pull request or my wiki page generated for that new resource we created, which is the teams channels policy, and I'm going to go and bring that in the main wiki repository. So that is it in a nutshell. Hopefully you guys contribute to the project. Please go ahead, submit pull request. This is a really good way for you to get in touch directly with the core team. So Microsoft engineers that are at the other end of the GitHub repository, helping you get started with providing your first resource for Office 365 DSC. We're always looking for people to just test the resources, log issues. If you have questions, please use the GitHub repository. So I know the tab can be confusing because it says issues, but if you can go in and report or ask any question that you have, provide feedback from here, this actually helps us build this knowledge base that other people will benefit from. So on that note, I wish you folks a good day.